On the surface, Jekyll and Hyde is an intriguing text about a man's transformation or his ability to transform from one character into another, and a novel about scientific discovery. But the text really comes to life if we consider it as a critique of the Victorian society in which it is set and first received. Stevenson meant the novel as a critique of that society and a way through which we can better understand Victorian society and the way in which Victorian society can help us to better understand the novel itself. In this presentation, I hope to introduce you to some of the key contextual ideas, the concerns and fears of Victorian society at the time, and how they can help us to understand both the characters and the events of the novel. The first idea is that Victorian society is one concerned with appearances, a judgmental society with a need to adhere to a strict moral code and to live up to an idealised version of gentlemanly behaviour, the archetype of the Victorian gentleman, if you like. Utterson's self-control at the start of the novel seems to stem from a desire to maintain his facade of respectability under the judgmental eye of Victorian society, whilst Jekyll's creation of Hyde develops out of a fear of this judgment, and Hyde is a way in which he is able to release and satisfy his inner desires without being judged by the critical eye of society at large. On the opening page of the novel, we are introduced to Gabriel Utterson, the lawyer, and he appears to be the very model of Victorian moral code and the fear of judgment. He is described as being austere with himself, never lighted by a smile. He is self-controlled. He is emotionless in lots of ways. Stevenson also informs us that he drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages. With gin being the working class drink of Victorian society, Utterson cannot be seen to drink gin in public for fear of the shame that it will bring upon his character. Jekyll is very much a man who is trapped by this judgment of society. Stevenson describes to us on his laboratory the 3 dusty windows barred with iron. In chapter 7, when he sat at his window, he is described like some disconsolate prisoner. And then in Jekyll's own words in chapter 10, he informs us of the prison house of his disposition and the fact that his devil had been long caged and he came out roaring. Through Stevenson's persistent use of words in the semantic field of imprisonment, we learn how Jekyll is trapped inside a body that he doesn't want to be in. He is unable to be the man he wants to be through fear of judgment from Victorian society. It is only once we get to chapter 10 and we hear Jekyll's own voice for the first time that we learn of the way in which Hyde was a creation by Jekyll to avoid moral judgment. Jekyll tells us that he found it hard to reconcile with his imperious desire to carry his head high, and it came about that he concealed his pleasures with an almost morbid sense of shame. He is forced to feel shameful about the man that he is. And therefore, for Jekyll, Hyde becomes a thick cloak, a perfect metaphor to describe a man who conceals and protects Jekyll, allows him to be his true self without the fear of judgment. Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species is probably the most influential text released in the middle of the 19th century, because his theories of evolution challenge the entrenched religious belief in creationist theory, the idea that God created the earth. The character's reaction to Hyde, who is in some way a manifestation of Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution, he is something pre-evolved, if you like, and their inability to describe him perhaps is a reflection of Victorian society's inability to accept Darwin's theory of evolution. And following that, the refusal of Utterson and other characters to acknowledge Hyde's significance appears to mirror Victorian society's reluctance to accept a theory which so fundamentally challenged existing ideology. And that is why they are unable to accept Hyde as human. If they accept Hyde as human, they are forced to accept this theory which challenges religious belief. Their problem with Darwin's theory stems from the fact that Victorian society is one which is obsessed and fixated by progress, moral progress, scientific progress, industrial progress. Indeed, it is a society which made more progress than any other in history. That is why Hyde is so repugnant to Victorians, because to them he represents a regression, a step backwards in a society obsessed with making progress. And what Hyde does is he actually forces the people of that society to confront the notion that they too have this primitive, darker side to them, this regressive element within them. Hyde throughout the novel is represented as something primitive, pre-evolved, a regressive form. He is described as something troglodytic, like some damn juggernaut. The use of juggernaut here, this mythical, unstoppable force, reveals to us that the members of Victorian society cannot describe Hyde in human terms. He is then described as hardly human and has Satan's signature upon a face, an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. If they acknowledge Hyde as human, they are forced to confront the idea that he is one of them, that they are like him, that they too have this darker element within him. By making him something other, something mythical, something like Satan, they are able to reject Hyde and reject what he seems to represent. Is that actually all of the other characters who judge Hyde and judge Jekyll actually reveal this darkness within themselves. If we look at Sawbones' transformation, he turns sick and white with a desire to kill him. Sawbones embodies the animalistic behaviour of Hyde at the same time as he is judging him. Lanyon, with his flesh fallen away, has become something monstrous, like Utterson, who is appalled by his behaviour because he too has become a monster. So at the same time they are judging Hyde, they are also demonstrating the behaviour that he enacts himself. Stevenson is deeply concerned with what he saw as the duality of man, the idea that we all have this dark side, and particularly concerned with the notion that the suppression of this dark side will only increase its intensity. He is also concerned, however, not just with the duality of man, but with the duality of Victorian society itself. The novel therefore acts as a criticism of what Stevenson saw as the duality of Victorian society, the dirty, poverty-stricken, immoral backstreets hidden behind a facade of pristine streets and wealthy neighbourhoods. It's an idea inspired by Stevenson's own experience growing up in Edinburgh. He was the gentleman by day, just as Utterson would have been, but would then visit the brothels and drinking houses of the back streets of Edinburgh by night. In the same way that Stevenson encourages the reader to criticise the duality of human beings who hide their true nature behind a pristine facade, so he encourages us to criticise a society which ignores the reality of its poverty-stricken neighbourhoods in favour of maintaining their facade of wealth and respectability. The duality of man is most powerfully reflected through the dichotomy of Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll describes the way in which man is not truly one but truly two, where the repetition of truly establishes this as a statement of fact. He leaves no room for doubt. He suggests that all men as we meet them are commingled out of good and evil, and talks about the thorough and primitive duality of man. The word primitive there lets us know that this is a state of man which goes back to the origins of our species. The duality of Victorian society is best represented through Jekyll's own house, and the contrast we see between his entrance at the front and Hyde's entrance round the back. Jekyll's entrance is described as wore a great air of wealth and comfort. Utterson sees the hall as the pleasantest room in all of London. Meanwhile, Hyde's entrance is described as having a door which was blistered and disdained, a sinister block of building which thrusts out into the street. Just as Hyde represents the darker side of Jekyll's character, so his entrance represents the darker, more sinister element of his house. It is easy to see from this model how Utterson might have got confused and failed to recognise the connection between Jekyll's front entrance and the back door of Hyde's that he sees with Enfield. The two are on streets apart. However, more than just Utterson's stupidity, this failure to realise is probably more Utterson's denial of the truth. Throughout this novel, Utterson consistently denies the idea of duality, both in terms of man and society. This duality of society is best reflected in chapter 4. After the Carew murder case, Utterson is making his way home. It was by this time about 9 in the morning and the first fog of the season. A great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was constantly charging and routing these embattled vapours, for here it would be dark like the back end of evening, and there would be a glow of a rich lurid brown like the light of some strange conflagration. And here for a moment the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling wreaths. The dismal quarter of Soho seen under its changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps, which had been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to battle this mournful re-invasion of darkness, seemed in the lawyer's eyes like a district of some city in a nightmare. It is this battle between light and dark that we see so often as a motif in the novel. And after the brutal murder of Carew by Hyde, it is the darkness which starts to take over the light. It is seen as a mournful re-invasion, an attack on the goodness of Victorian society. Most importantly, this is the moment where Utterson is forced to confront that duality of society which is kept so well hidden. The fog lifts just for a moment and reveals the dismal quarter of Soho. It reveals the drinking houses and prostitution that Stevenson would have seen in his daily life in Edinburgh. And it is no coincidence that it appears to Utterson as the district of some city in a nightmare. This is indeed a nightmarish vision for Utterson, because he is forced to recognise for the first time the dirty back streets that he is keen to keep so hidden. If you consider how Stevenson presents Hyde as a monstrous character in this play, it is largely because he is symbolic of man's dark side. His monstrosity intensifies because the dark side grows the more it is suppressed. And in that way, he acts as a criticism of man's desire to suppress their dark side. He is also monstrous because he is a physical manifestation of Darwin's theory of evolution, the idea that we are evolved from more primitive forms, and because of that he is seen as monstrous by the members of Victorian society that he meets, because he represents a regression in a society obsessed by progress. Therefore society has to turn him into a monster, into something other so that they can reject him. In the slides that follow are paragraphs and essays which comment on this notion of monstrosity and duality. What I've tried to do in those paragraphs is to focus on the techniques used by Stevenson in creating Hyde and that idea of duality.